Yeah, so I want to thank the organizers. It's been a pleasure. I think a good conference is one that forces you to read, and I've already downloaded like 10 papers since this morning. So it's been productive. And a lot of the talks, as you'll see, are really related to what I'm going to present. So this is a framework I like to think about when I talk about animal decision making. And what I'm going to try to argue today is that we can study this framework in the field with freely behaving animals in their natural environment. So take a bat, take your favorite animal model. And as this bat is about to move, to forage, it has access to many types of information. It can use social information or cognitive processes, sensor information, predispositions, and so on. And the output that we can measure in the field mostly is movement. Okay, so this is what we can measure when we're trying to measure its decisions, or it's one of the easiest things that we can measure. Now, today I'm going to focus on a slightly more specific decision process that fruit bats engage in every day. I think it's a decision that you can also relate to, and that's why I chose it. So fruit bats, as their name suggests, they forage on fruits, which means that they know where food is. Food is distributed in fixed locations. Of course, you can also explore, as was suggested in the previous talk, but they know something about the positions of the food. Food is also changing in time. So the z-axis here is trying to it's the big time. Okay, and you need to know, as you know, food is ephemeral. Fruit is ephemeral in time. So a tree can supply food for, I don't know, 2 weeks or a month, depending also on competition. So there are other factors that they also should map, perhaps, such as sociality. So we know that the presence of other individuals is something very important for them. And there might be other factors that are not presented here. And the question is, the general question that I try to think about is how they integrate all of this into deciding what they're going to do tonight. Now, before talking about how we do this and giving you a few examples, I want to show you a little bit, a few techniques that are being used today. And I think most of you don't track animals outdoors, so I'm going to elaborate on this a little bit to give you an overview of what people are doing. And so these are our sensors that we develop in my lab, but there are also many others around. And here are a few of so we call it a multi-sensor. So they're, of course, we can track movement. So these are thousands of bats exiting a cave. You can see we're tracking several dozens of them with GPS or some other movement tracker. We can track acceleration. So here in red, you can see the wing beat of the animal. I'll come back to this in a second, show you how useful this is. By the way, it's overlaid on the audio. So the blue is audio. These are echolocation signals. And we can record audio, as I already mentioned, and I'll come back to this again in a second because it's super useful. And we can also measure physiology. So of course, we're not non-invasively outdoors, but here we can measure the heartbeat of the animal. We can also do EEG sometimes, depending on where the animal exactly is moving. So I want to say a few words about each of these sensors. I'll start with the microphones, which are super useful for bats, but not only for bats, and I'll show you why. So these are spectrograms I'm sure you're familiar with, frequency over time. These are the echolocation signals emitted by the bats. So the fact that the bats are constantly emitting sound is super useful for me. It allows me to infer a lot about their behavior. For example, I can ask how do they respond to the presence of a conspecific. Okay, so this is the bat carrying the microphone. You can see the signals are very loud. And this is a conspecific, and there's a lot of literature and some of it is also ours about jamming avoidance and the whole question of how they avoid interference, which is not something I'm going to talk about unless you ask. I know when the bat is an echolocating bat is attacking prey. So this sequence, we call it an attack or a buzz, is very, very distinct. You see the intervals are becoming shorter. The update rate, sensory update rate increases. We see the signals become shorter. The energy decreases. So I know that this bat is now attacking something. Sometimes I know what is being attacked. For example, this is a frog-eating bat we worked on in Panama together with Rachel Page. So as its name suggests, it eats frogs. And in this case, it was attacking a male Tunjara frog. And we know this based on the calls emitted by the frog, which we also record. And we also know that this frog did not vocalize anymore based on the chewing sounds right after the attack. So we can even record foraging success. Okay, all of this using sound. So I want to give you an example. I'll play back a sequence recorded on board the bat. It will sound a little bit like this. It's not this bat. It's a bat in Mexico. You will hear, of course, we downsample. If you notice the frequencies, most of this is ultrasonic. So we downsample it so that you can hear it. And you'll hear a lot of wind. You'll hear since it's an attack, you'll hear the rate increasing. And notice if you can pay attention to the end, see if you can notice something at the end. Okay, who noticed something special at the end? Was it a successful attack? Let me ask that. Yeah, so you can hear the chewing. There was no bird. No, it was chewing a beetle, probably a crunchy beetle. You could hear the right, and maybe I'll play it again. You can hear the chew echolocation at the end. Now, okay. I want to play two other sounds that we recorded on board bats. They're more silent. Let me boost the volume. So the first one, let's see if you can hear. It's very, very quiet. I can hear it, but you can probably not. These are jackals entering the city. Okay, so it's a fruit bat flying above the city in Tel Aviv, and it is recording jackals. So I can also use my bat to record, other stuff that is going on. This is, it could be useful if I'm thinking of the animal. It's very useful if we think of acoustic surveying, for example, which is something that many ecologists want to do today. And the last thing, if this is over, we can also monitor anthropogenic behavior or activity. So this is the bat flying above a local soccer, like a neighborhood soccer field. And it's good that you don't understand the Hebrew. Okay, sometimes we can say something about the incoming information too. So this is a bat that expertises on Doppler shifts. You see it has these very special signals, we call them constant frequency. In this case, the bat is flying near this hedge, and you can see this is an echo. Okay, so the echo is Doppler shifted. It's above the main signal, and you can actually see. So you see that you get echoes that are with different Doppler shifts depending on the radial velocity. So you can really see the hedge in here. That's what I'm trying to convey. If you know how to read this, you really can say how far it's flying from the hedge, and is there a hedge, and so on. And this very peculiar thing that you see at the end, these are the wings of, so a moth has been detected probably. You can see it here also, it decreases the frequency. And these are Doppler shifts created by the wings of the moth moving forward and backward, okay? So we can actually also see what the bat is seeing, what it is receiving from its point of view. Okay, so that was the microphone. Now I want to say a few words about accelerometers. I already said a few, and I will come back to them at the end. So these are two different sensors. Actually, this is the same attack that I showed you earlier on with the echolocation in blue. And this is actually the magnetometer, which kind of measures, if you're not calibrating it, it measures turning. Okay, so what we see here is that the bat is turning. This is the attack, by the way, and nothing. If I look at the audio only, nothing happened here. But if I look at the movement, I see that the bat is turning, probably already detected the prey. And here you can see, so this is the wing beat, and here you can see that it stops flapping its wing. By the way, I think this is not synchronized. I think this should be pushed a little bit to the right. I think this is before we had some issue with the synchronization. So if you take these two together, you can really imagine the bat, right? Turning after the prey and stopping its wing beat. And indeed, this is how bats capture prey. Okay, so this is what it looks like. Right, turning, detection. By the way, this is BBC, so the moth is tethered, as always is the BBC. But turning and then capturing the moth without stopping the wing beat at the end. If you notice, by the way, as you see, they capture the prey usually with their wing or with their tail membrane, not with the mouth directly. And the last thing that I want to show you that we can measure on board the bat is the environment. So we can place different types of sensors on the animal itself in order to monitor its environment. So in this case, we use temperature sensors in order to examine the ambient temperature. And this was some collaboration we did with researchers from geography to show that we can use bats in order to recreate. This is the heat island map of Tel Aviv. Okay, so we compare this to actual measurements that were done. The bats do it very, very quickly. You see that, for example, this area is around here. It's a park area, and you can see how the temperature drops by 3 to 4 degrees immediately once the bats, not because of the bats, but the bats can monitor this. The last thing that I want to show is not measured on the bat before I move to talking about actual research. So it's not measured on the bat, but I want to show you how we use environmental measurements in order to complete our information. So again, this is related to echolocating bats, but you could also do this with vision, and we have. So in this case, we take a LiDAR, an airborne drone carried LiDAR. Can you see it? No, not super important. Yeah, there it is. And we create a high resolution 3D map of the region where our specific bats fly. It's some kind of an agricultural area in northern Israel, and we can then take acoustic simulations, finite element models, for example, take the 3D model and reconstruct the echo that the bat would receive when flying over this terrain according to the angle, the specific angle in which it is flying, and then we can do many things with this, right? We could train a neural network, which we have done to try to navigate like a bat. Or in this case, I'm presenting you, this is the acoustic entropy map of the region. So you can think of it as how much acoustic information is available for a bat while flying over this terrain. And then we can ask questions, which I will not talk about today, but why did the bat select this specific trajectory and not another trajectory? Can it do with the amount of information, acoustic information available to it? Okay, so now I want to go back to this question and talk about what we know about it. And I will start with space. Okay, what do bats know about space? I'm back to the fruit bats. Okay, and the idea of a cognitive map was already presented several times today, so I don't have to go back to that. I'll just say that in order to prove, quotation marks, prove it in nature, we need to show, that's at least the common way, you need to show that an animal can perform shortcuts. Okay, the idea is that if it can perform many shortcuts between familiar locations, then it has a map, a mental map of the region. And I'm not going into whether it's a graph or a map. Okay, I'm not going into those fine details. The truth is I don't really care. We're looking more globally. I mean, we can argue about that, but I'm not even sure what's my opinion. Probably it's a graph. So this is a bat that we've tracked for many, many nights. And as you can see, it flew so over 100 nights. Each night has a different color. And you see these bats, again, they're fruit bats. So there's a fruit tree here. They fly many kilometers to it. They cannot see it, by the way, at any point until they reach it. And then there's another fruit tree here, another fruit tree here. Again, all very, very far. And at some point, it performs this, which looks like a shortcut, right, between tree C and tree B. So this suggests a shortcut, and many people indeed in the past published and said, okay, here's evidence for shortcutting. But we argue that you never know what is, since you don't know the history of this animal, you can never argue that it's a novel shortcut. Okay, maybe I forgot the word novel when I described shortcuts. So we need to claim, or we need to show that this trajectory has not been traveled by this bat before, right? If you want to actually argue that it's using a map, and this is impossible to do because this animal could be 30 years old, or I don't know, right, even 2 years old, but we don't have its history. So this is why we came up with the following idea. We decided to establish our own colony of fruit bats in Tel Aviv University. So the bats roost in a room like this, not as big, but similar and not as high, so we can catch them. And they fly out and they do whatever they want. So they volunteer basically to come back and participate in our experiments. And you can see here one individual, 3 nights, color-coded. Well, I like, she's not flying, it's a she's not flying very far. I'll show you much farther trajectories in a second. But what I like about this is that already on her 2nd or 3rd night outside, she finds, she sleeps over at friends, if you want. Okay, so she finds a nearby colony, she sleeps there, and then she comes back. And similarly, we have, so actually now we have bats, this has been running for almost 10 years, and we have bats that disappear and come back every summer at the same day, more or less, or every winter. Actually, it's more in winter, sorry, at the same day, more or less. Okay, so we have bats moving between the colonies and between our colony, just like bats do. And now this, of course, allows us to track the full history of these animals. So these animals, not these animals, unfortunately. Actually, the whole reason why we studied these animals is that we cannot do this with these animals, right? So I'll show you now. So the colony is somewhere here. And in a second, you'll see the trajectories of one individual over dozens of nights, appearing as single trajectories, color-coded from blue to red. And when observing this, it's hard to see, but most of the trajectories are, maybe we could call them model-based, okay? So they're flying to nearby familiar trees. But sometimes they do these extreme exploratory trajectories, arriving at locations where they have never been before. So this is more than this is around 10 kilometers from the colony, and you see they have never been in this region before. Okay, this individual has never been in this region before, and still it finds its way in a rather straight line back to the colony. Okay, so I'm really interested also in these exploratory trajectories. Maybe we can talk about this later, but today I'm going to talk about to show you that they can really perform shortcuts. They can really find their way back home. Okay, this has to do just with how they increase their home range. And here, again, I will say this, even though I already said this, these are fruit bats. So that's very useful, because if you're looking at an insectivorous bat who's just looking for ephemeral food, it's very hard to say something about its intentions. Okay, it's moving somewhere and you can't know if this is indeed, we can't argue, or you can't even hypothesize if this is what it's planning to do, or is it just randomly searching. And with fruit bats, since they return to the same trees again and again and again, we have thousands of trees mapped around the colony area, then we can really at least hypothesize that when a bat moves between two familiar trees, this is what it's intended to do. So the short story is that they indeed perform shortcuts. Here's one example. It's not a very long one. In a second, I'll show you that they can perform much longer shortcuts. What you see here, on the night of the shortcut, the bat leaves the colony, it flies around, it forages, it flies here, it forages, and then it performs the shortcut. In white, you see everything that this bat did before. So you see it never took this trajectory before. Okay, we also had to think of how to define novel, because obviously they've been in this region. But you can see actually that on former events, on former nights, it went back. Okay, look at these white trajectories. It did this before, and it went back the long way. And then at some point, around night 30, if I remember correctly, it has this eureka moment, and it takes a shortcut. And we can see many, many shortcuts. Some of them are even many, many kilometers long. On average, we see that bats do this every several days. So it's not something that they do all the time. It's something that they do when they need it, you know. And we also see other strategies, which I don't show here today, but we also see them following roads and following landmarks. Okay, so I'm not saying they only use map-based navigation, probably the opposite, but they can use map-based navigation. Very quickly, we don't see any change in the probability or propensity of doing shortcuts over time. It seems that they can do them from the beginning. But if you look at the at the lengths, okay, how far the shortcut, how long the shortcuts are, you see an increase, obviously, because they are mapping the area. Okay, so maybe I'll claim this already now. I think they're doing this using vision. We have a lot of evidence to support this hypothesis, and you know, they're gradually mapping more and more of a larger part of this environment, and therefore they can perform longer shortcuts. We also notice a lot of individual variability, which I think is very interesting. So if you look at this is the ID, they're just ranked. This is their home range normalized, and all of these bats were measured on the same night. Okay, here are three examples, and you can see a very, very non-exploratory bat. So this bat repeatedly goes to the same nearby trees, and a very, very exploratory bat on the other side. Okay, so huge differences, and we hypothesize that if these bats are indeed mapping the environment, then we should see some correlation between this tendency to explore or not and their ability to return, to navigate, or to come back home. So for this, we perform the translocation experiment. We move the bats somewhere where they have never been before. Now, usually when you do these experiments, you move the animal 100 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers. Okay, in our case, we knew the home range, so we could move them 5 kilometers and still say they have never been here before. And you see that indeed an exploratory bat, like this one that I showed you before, so when we place it 5 kilometers away from the colony, it flies home quite directly. And this is the most extreme case. On the other hand, we move the bat 5 kilometers here, and you see how it returns back home. Okay, so this bat has no clue where it's going. By the way, this bat, I like to think of this idea. It has been living like 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers from the beach for 70 nights, and it just, it is an interpretation, but obviously it has no clue that this is a beach, right? It knows nothing about the sea, and it just flies into the sea. This is, by the way, wind. The triangle is created by the wind, which is, blowing towards the south. We can quantify this. We measure the straightness index. How straight do they fly home? We see that this is the proximity to the translocation. So have they been near this translocation point in the past? And you see there's no correlation. So even if a bat has been near this location in the past, it doesn't mean that it will navigate home more directly. On the other hand, if we look at how exploratory this bat is, we see that the more the bat is exploratory, the straighter its navigation home is. By the way, this also, without going into all of the navigation theory, this also excludes other explanations, like there is this template matching hypothesis that if you find yourself in a new location, you look around, you look for something familiar, and then you move in kind of a route following strategy, and this kind of excludes these possibilities. If you're curious about this bat, we color code what happened with this bat. By the way, we also have bats that never come home, and then we just don't know what happened. But this is like a very unique example of a bat that did come home eventually, and we got this very, so some of the other bats might have done even crazier stuff. What we did here is we overlay the altitude, the height with color. We color code the altitude on the trajectory, and you can see that this bat is gradually climbing. Okay, and what I think happened, of course, I don't know, but I think there's a cliff. This is a cliff, so the bat was flying low, but gradually ascending, and at some point it just turned around and saw, okay, the city is over there, and then it heads back towards the city and back home. Yeah, the last thing I want to say about this before moving to talk about temporal maps is that this was all happening in an urban environment. Okay, and people often ask me, bats have not evolved to use these environments and to use vision in such an environment. Fine, that's all true, but bats have evolved, these bats, fruit bats at least, have evolved to use vision for large-scale navigation, and suddenly you have all of these visual cues, so why not use them? But I want to say more than that, the urban environment is also an experiment, okay? You put these animals in a very different environment from what they have evolved to use, in a rapidly changing environment, and we see, and we examine this, and we see differences. So here you can see 5 bats in a rural environment. The white are settlements. Okay, so you can see that this bat is in a less settled, let's say, environment, and these are bats in an urban environment. Okay, and it's a bit hard to see, but you immediately see that these bats are more conservative. They fly back. So these are different nights of the same color. They're the same bat. So you can see that these bats tend to be very conservative, flying back and forth to the same trees night after night, while these bats are much more exploratory. If you look at the yellow points, these points depict foraging trees. Okay, so these bats can sometimes only settle for one tree and just go back and forth every night, while these bats, as you can see, explore many more trees. We've also looked in the lab. We can run these bats in laboratory experiments and run behavioral essays, personality essays, whatever you want to call it, and we see that urban bats. So this is a kind of a risk-taking. It's maybe equivalent to the elevated maze in rodents or something like that. We place the bats in a situation that requires boldness to obtain food, and we see these are pups. Okay, and we see that urban pups tend to be bolder than rural pups, but if we cross-foster them, we see that this tendency reverses, or mostly so in this case they're fostered with urban bats with rural mothers, and rural bats with urban mothers, and we mostly see a change over here. Okay, with the pups that were reared with urban mothers suddenly tend to be much more exploratory. Okay, so as I said, as I promised, I'm going to talk about space, and now I'll say a few words about time. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Clayton famous experiments, episodic memory, or maybe we should not call them episodic memory, so maybe I'll say this term once. I call it temporal maps to avoid this challenge. So if you're not familiar, very briefly, these jays, they cache food, and if they cache 2 types of food, one preferred, worms, and one less preferred, peanuts, and then so they cache them in different wells, and if you take the jay out of the room and bring it back in, depending on how much time passed since it cached them, it will go for different types of food. Okay, so if it's been a short time, it will go for the worms. Let's say the worm is over here, I don't know. And if it comes back after a week, it will go for the peanuts because the worms are not relevant anymore. Okay, they're rotten. So this suggests that the animals know something about time. Let's say like this. And we were wondering whether fruit bats will exhibit similar behavior in a completely wild scenario. The idea is that fruit bats, they forage on fruit, but also on nectar. And we hypothesize that nectar will have a shorter time periods in which it is relevant because there is less, and also because there's a lot more competition. So this is the first thing that we validated. So we can see here on the x-axis time in nights, and we can see the probability of returning to a tree, and you can see that it drops faster for a nectar tree than for a fruit tree. Okay, so bats will visit a fruit tree, the same tree. So this is the same tree even after, to some extent, even after 10 or 20 nights, but they will not do so for nectar tree. So indeed, we confirmed our hypothesis. There's a different time scale for these two resources. And now we repeated the Clayton experiment, but in a wild setup. So because these bats, as I said, they're in our colony, we can decide whether we let them out or not. Okay, so we kept them in for one night or for multiple nights, 4 or 7 nights, assuming that or hypothesizing that if they know something about this difference, they should behave differently with fruit and nectar trees, right? Depending on whether they've been in for one night or for several nights. Now, if you look at the inexperienced bats, right, we also follow their ontogeny, so we follow them over time. If you look at inexperienced bats, there seems to be no difference between the two. They will return both to nectar in blue and to fruit in red, even whether if it's after one night or 4 to 7 nights. Again, I'm talking about returning to the same trees. Okay, so they remember the trees and they go back to them, like the whales in the Clayton experiment. But if we look at the experienced bats, these are bats that have been out, here for several weeks already. Now we see a very clear difference. We see that after one night, this is not significant, but maybe there's a slight difference here. But the important thing is that it completely reverses, right? And after multiple nights, they will hardly or less return to nectar trees, exactly as we expect, if they know something about time. Okay, and they will return much more to fruit trees. So this suggests to me, at least, and I'll be happy to hear your opinion, that they know something about the time that passed. We also looked at whether they plan or whether they exhibit any form of future oriented behavior, and we think they do. So what I plotted here is their velocity when they leave, or the speed actually, when they leave the cave, as a function of the tree that they're heading to. So on those nights when they're not exploring, when they're flying to a specific tree in a direct flight, right, we check whether there is any correlation between the speed at the moment when they leave their colony, okay, so not the average speed, even though you also see a correlation there, and the distance, okay, and you see that when they're heading towards farther trees, they start flying faster immediately when they fly, when they take off. Okay, so we know they know the direction because we see they're flying straight. And this seems that they also know something about the distance, and that they are planning, that the moment when they leave the colony, they are already planning where they're heading. In the city, this means flights of up to 30 minutes. Usually everything is relatively close, so they're not planning hours ahead, but a tree could be a few minutes ahead, a few minutes of flight, or up to 30 minutes. In some cases, they are heading to high protein-rich trees. Okay, there are nights when they're deprived of protein, and then they fly to these. Protein is something very difficult to get for a fruit bat, right? There's not much protein in fruit. Some species have more protein, and then we see that on certain nights they head to these protein rich trees, which are depicted on this map in blue. So in red, so everything, all of the trees are in green, and in red are these rich protein trees that they can be, as you can see, up to many kilometers away. And on these nights, we see that they head directly to these protein-rich trees, and they will often, which they have visited before. Okay, again, if we think of episodic memory, and we see that they will skip many trees on the way. Okay, so there are many fruit. Sugar-rich trees that are familiar to them, and they will skip them and fly straight to the tree that they are aiming for, even sometimes, as I said, 20 or 30 minutes of flight, ignoring everything on their way. Okay, the third story that I want to tell you about has to do with the acquisition of navigation. So far I talked about the bats, but I said nothing about how they acquire this knowledge, or I showed you that experienced bats are different from inexperienced bats. But I didn't say anything about how they learn this. And usually in nature, these bats, the fruit bats, the pups, are carried by their mothers. Okay, I don't know if you noticed, there's a pup on this bat, and this is very typical. The mothers carry the pups, And we were wondering whether the pups learn anything, what's the functionality of this behavior. Okay, not all bats do this, by the way. Some bats just leave their pups. In this experiment, and again, this is something you could do only thanks to these miniature sensors. It's a very difficult experiment because I didn't say this, but our sensors are loggers, so they fall off and we have to retrieve them. Okay, that's why this colony is so useful. But if the bat disappears, there's no data. Okay, if the logger doesn't turn on, there's also no data, and that happens also a lot. But in this case, we need to retrieve data from both mother and pup, right? So we have a tag on the pup and a tag on the mother, and if one of them disappears, then there is no data. So if the chances of getting data is 50% for one, this drops right to 25%. So all of this is to say that these two PhD candidates or former PhD students worked very, very hard on this study. And what we find, most of this is really, there's no way to describe it except for anecdotally, but you'll see that I think we learn quite a bit from it. So what we found is that the mothers, the mother here is depicted in this turquoise, the mother will fly out with the pup on it. Okay, look at this dashed orange. This means that the pup is on the mother. Okay, and in a second I'll show you how I know that it's on the mother. And then she will drop it off on a tree. Okay, so it's heavy. The pup can weigh 50% of the mother's weight. She drops it off up to a few kilometers from the colony. She flies. This is real data. Okay, she flies to a distant, a more remote tree. She forages. She comes back. She picks the bat up and goes back to the cave. And this is their behavior for like around 10 weeks. And then more or less around week 10, she will just go out and leave the pup in the cave. Okay, and if the pup is brave, it will fly out alone. Okay, you see this is now a solid line. And what does it do? It flies straight to the same tree where she left it on the previous nights. Okay, so she did this for many, many nights, and now it flies straight there, and it also follows more or less the same trajectory. And then it starts gradually increasing its exploring and increasing its home range. Okay, I just want to argue that there are many trees around. These are drop-off trees. Okay, this is the cave. You can see they're all around. And in green, you can see also many other trees. This is a figure we prepared for the reviewer because the reviewer, one of the reviewers, maybe he's in the room, probably not, said, okay, it's Israel, it's a desert, right? So there's only one tree probably, and that's why they're flying to this tree. So no, there are many trees around. So we do ride camels to work, but there are many trees around. And the fact that the bat is flying to this, the pup is flying to this specific tree is, we could also quantify it statistically, but I don't think you need with this environment. How do I know that the pup is on the bat? So this is where, on the mother, so this is where these accelerometers can again become handy. You can see here the acceleration recorded on the mother and the pup. Okay, so this is acceleration when the mother is flying with the pup, and you see that the pup is on it, so it's perfectly synchronized. It's in antiphase because it's upside down, right? The pup, and once the mother drops the pup, like here, you can see the mother flying, and the pup is now hanging on the tree. So we know it's on the pup. And now I want to show you two. So just to summarize, it seems like the pups are learning to navigate from their mothers to these trees. Maybe I'll say why we think this happens, and they're doing it while being carried on their mothers upside down. Okay, which is for me was a big surprise. I thought they're probably flying behind the mothers. Why are they doing this? Of course, we don't know. It could have many different functionalities, but what we think, and it's related to these anecdotes that I'll show in a second, is that they're kind of, so when you're a bat and you fly out for the first time, and you can easily fly 50 kilometers, the chances that you'll find your way back home are very, very low. We've seen it with our pups in our colony, which are released without their mothers. Okay, so we think that this is a kind of an anchor. They tell them, they show them, this is where you start your navigation or your foraging. These are not edible trees usually, so it's not that they're showing them food. And from here, your way back home. And it seems that this could be one of the functions. Here's an anecdote that also suggests why this might be useful. Not this one, the next one. Here we just see something interesting. This is a pup that just didn't go out. So the mother left it. You see the mother, but the pup stayed in. So when the mother comes back to the cave, okay, at 1 a.m. and realizes that the pup is inside, by the way, I have no clue how she realizes that it didn't go out, but suddenly she carries it back to the same tree. You see it's on her. So she goes back basically to the previous step of carrying the pup, and then on the next night it already flies out alone. And my favorite anecdote is an anecdote, but still I think suggests many ideas about the animal's cognition. So this mother flew out, the pup also flew out. Okay, you can see here she came back at 2:30, and the pup is still out. It's not in the cave. Okay, and then almost an hour later at 3:20, she flies out again, my interpretation, to search for it. Where does she go? To the exact same tree where she used to leave it. In the meanwhile, you see that the pup moved between two trees, explored, but when she arrives, the pup is here, and then she carries it back at 4:20, she carries it back home. So in my opinion, this says a lot about the reasoning that these animals can exhibit. It also suggests that this is another useful advantage of these trees. They are kind of like I don't know what are they called in English, but meeting points for kids in the shopping mall or something like this. When a kid is lost, so that's where their parents look for it. So this is what we see. The last thing that I want to show, we still have a few minutes, right? Is how we try to model this. Okay, so I do want to say something about very, very simple model that we used in a slightly simpler scenario. So these are so far I talked about the same bat, the Egyptian fruit bat, and now I'm going to talk about a nectarivorous bat that forages in northern Mexico. It's called Leptonictaris. I'll explain in a second, it's slightly easier to model because even though we know quite a lot about those fruit bats, there's still a lot of unknown. We are trying to model them, but it's more complicated. And here I'll show you a slightly simpler environment. So this is what we're these bats are facing. Okay, so there's a lot of food, but there's also a lot of competition. And the question is how to behave in this environment, how to sample your field. So these nectarivorous bats, they arrive in northern, so this is the border with the US, so they arrive in their colony, they migrate there in spring because they feed on these nectar providing cacti, and this is everything they eat. So during this time of the year, you can really model the resource. In a second, I'll show how we really model the resource, which is very, very difficult to do outdoors. By the way, there are also the bats that pollinate agave, so that's why you have a tequila bottle. So without them, there is no tequila. Actually, and you can see a very, peculiar maybe behavior. They roost in this colony. There's thousands or even hundreds of thousands of bats. These are the pups. In this case, they don't carry the pups. So they are lactating at this time of the year. They leave the pups. You enter the colony. There are like thousands or hundreds of thousands of pups clustered together. And then they fly out, and you can see they can fly dozens of kilometers. Okay, so this one is our champion. It flew over 100 kilometers to what's over here. There's a field with cacti, many cacti. These cacti are distributed in fields which are scattered in this environment. Okay, without any clear, I cannot at least say what's the clear reason why you have a field of cacti here and not here. But as you see, they prefer these very long commutes. By the way, some of them cross the Trump wall every night and come back. And as I said, we can really sample the distribution of the available resource. So using a drone, we can image the field where the bats foraged and map all of the cacti. And if we come early in the morning, we even see how many flowers were available on each cactus. Okay, so these cacti, the second side of the story, they want to be pollinated by the bats. So they open their flowers every evening and they lose them on the next morning. Okay, so it's all specifically planned for the bats. And if we come and they give, and that's the nice thing. So their locations are constant, but the cacti, but the amount of nectar that they offer on a given night changes. Okay, and the bats have to remap this every night. So it's similar to the fruit bats, but now the time scale, instead of being weeks, is a night. Okay. Or maybe we also show there's some correlation between consecutive nights, but not very far from 100%. Okay, so if we come early in the morning, we can actually map and say, okay, this cactus had 4 flowers, this one had 2, this one had none. And the rate of nectar production is also something we can measure, and it's very, very, for a biologist, you could say it's constant. So we can actually model the system very, very, very good. We just looked, this is just to show you, so the colors here depict number of flowers, just to see that it's not as if it seems to be very uniformly distributed. Okay, so there's a good cactus here and a good cactus here and one here. It's not as if they're all in one certain location. So what does the behavior of the bat look like? Maybe you can imagine if you have this field with a lot of, with resource, nothing, the locations, nothing about how much. Oops, I didn't want you to start without me. And there's also a lot of competition. Okay, so you're going to visit, but there are going to be hundreds of bats in this. in this field tonight, what would your behavior look like? And this is what we see. Okay, so this is a full night. It's many hours. And gradually what you see is that the bats tend to return to the same cacti again and again. So at the beginning, they explore more, but then they create, we call these cores of preferred cacti, which they sample again and again and again and again. And over the night, this tendency increases. They explore less and exploit more. So we call these core cacti. This is the core of one individual. It's not a territory because the core can be distributed. Okay, within this territory, there are many cacti that are not visited. Okay, only the circled cacti are core cacti. And we looked at many different models to explain this behavior, and eventually we converged on this. I call it a reinforcement learning-like model. It's very simple, as you see in a second. So we assume that the bats memorize the weights of a certain number of cacti. We actually find that this number is not so important because there's so much competition. It's not important if you memorize all cacti in the field or only a few cacti in the field. So the weights per bat, okay, and per cactus, and they change per time according to your visitation. So every time you visit a cactus, you update the weight of this cactus according to a reinforcement learning like model. So there's no so there is a surprise, but the surprise is based on an average surprise. You could play with this, right? We just didn't. We saw that it provides a good enough explanation to the data, but you could make this instead of an average, you could change it dynamically per bat or along the night or whatever. So this is just how much nectar was consumed in this visit relative to the average with some kind of a learning parameter, which we also fit using a genetic algorithm. So we don't learn it from the data itself. And then when you're sampling where to visit, you take into account this weight of the cactus, the time it takes to arrive at this cactus, so basically how far it is, and also some kind of a constant time, which is how much time it takes you to exploit the cactus. And we find that this behavior, this approach, this model produces this behavior, which is also very similar to the bat's behavior. I see that I don't have here the slide that compares it to the bats, but I'll just show you what kind of behavior we observe, and I can tell you this is similar to the bat's behavior in many axes. So what we see here are the positions of actual cacti from an actual field where we run the model, and the colors depict individuals. So you see that cores are generated, and you see they're indeed cores and not territories, right? So the blue bat visits these cacti, but also these cacti. The size of the cactus reflects the number of visits. So a cactus that was visited more will have a larger size. And most cacti, as you see, are not shared. Sometimes the cacti are shared by one or two, by two, or sometimes even three individuals. But you see that largely they're owned by one specific individual, and this results in partitioning of the resource without any direct communication between the bats. Okay, so the entire communication is through depletion, right? So if I arrive in at a cactus, and somebody else just depleted this cactus, right? If you look at this equation, then I will update. So this will be small or zero, and I will decrease the weight of my cactus. And just by this very simple approach, they can partition the field, the resource between them. And we also show, unfortunately, I don't have this graph, I see, but we also show that this tendency to explore more at the beginning and gradually decrease exploration and increase exploitation comes out also from this model. Yeah, so I think it's been already too much. So I'll just remind you that this is the framework or the problem that I was thinking of. I showed you, I think that the bats know quite a lot about space. We now see that they know something about time. So you see this, maybe I didn't explain it, but this tree started fruiting earlier, and therefore it has less fruit at this time point. I didn't say much about sociality. We have several studies showing that bats will prefer a tree where there are other bats. So actually maybe opposite to your maybe first intuition, where suggesting that competition will deter the bats. But no, it seems that they actually prefer these bats, prefer trees where there are many other bats. And this is something we're trying to also measure and later on model. And I hope that I convince you that we can use these new miniature technologies in order to really address these questions in the field. And these are many students that have not been mentioned during my talk, and also several funding agencies. Thank you very much.